The winter winds of 1796 carried more than snow through the gilded corridors of the Winter Palace. They carried whispers that would outlive empires, rumors so vile they would poison the memory of Europe's most formidable female ruler for centuries to come. What began as the natural death of an aging empress would transform into the most scandalous lie in royal history, a fabrication so grotesque that it continues to overshadow one of history's most remarkable reigns even today. Catherine the Great died as she had lived, dramatically and without warning. But the story that emerged from her death chamber wasn't about the woman who had expanded an empire, corresponded with Voltaire, or crushed rebellions with iron resolve. Instead, it was about a horse, a pulley system, and an ending so perverse that decent people could barely speak it aloud. The tale spread like wildfire across European salons, taverns and courts, growing more elaborate and disturbing with each retelling. But here's what they don't want you to know. Every single word of that infamous horse scandal was a lie, carefully crafted by political enemies who understood something crucial about destroying powerful women. You don't defeat them with armies or arguments. You destroy them with stories so shocking that the truth becomes irrelevant. The scandal wasn't just slander, it was warfare by other means, and its success was so complete that most people today know Catherine the Great for a grotesque myth rather than her actual achievements. Tonight, we're going to strip away 3 centuries of lies and examine the real story behind Europe's most notorious royal scandal. We'll explore who created this vicious rumor, why it spread so effectively, and what it reveals about the lengths society will go to diminish women who dare to wield power without apology. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand how a German princess became Russia's greatest ruler, why her enemies needed to destroy her reputation, and how they succeeded so completely that their lie became more famous than her actual life. The truth about Catherine the Great isn't just more complex than the scandal suggests. It's far more dangerous to the established order that her enemies represented. Because once you understand who she really was and what she actually accomplished, the horse myth reveals itself as exactly what it was designed to be: a weapon of mass historical destruction. The woman born as Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg had no idea she would one day rule the largest empire on earth. Born in 1729 to a minor German prince, her early life was unremarkable by royal standards. She received the typical education of a noble daughter: languages, music, dancing, and the subtle arts of court politics. But beneath this conventional exterior, something extraordinary was taking shape. Sophie possessed an intellectual hunger that would define her entire existence, devouring books on philosophy, history, and political theory with an appetite that alarmed her tutors. Her transformation from German princess to Russian empress began with a summons that would change the course of European history. In 1744, Empress Elizabeth of Russia invited the 15-year-old Sophie to St. Petersburg as a potential bride for her nephew and heir, the future Peter III. This wasn't romance, it was geopolitics. Russia needed strong alliances, and marriage remained the primary diplomatic tool for securing them. The journey across frozen Europe was Sophie's first taste of the vast distances and harsh realities that defined Russian life. When she arrived at the Winter Palace, she encountered a world of Byzantine complexity, where every gesture carried political weight and survival depended on reading the subtle currents of court intrigue. The teenage princess faced a choice that would determine her fate: remain the German girl she had been born, or transform herself into something Russia could accept. Sophie chose transformation with a thoroughness that bordered on self-annihilation. She threw herself into learning Russian with such intensity that courtiers whispered she spoke it better than many nobles. She converted to Orthodox Christianity, taking the name Catherine, and embraced her new faith with apparent sincerity. Most importantly, she began the careful work of building alliances, understanding that her survival depended not on her husband's protection, but on her own political acumen. The marriage ceremony in 1745 was a spectacular display of imperial power, but behind the golden facade lay a union that was doomed from its first day. Peter III was everything Catherine was not: childish where she was mature, impulsive where she was calculating, and contemptuous of the very empire he was meant to inherit. Their wedding night was reportedly a disaster, and their relationship never recovered from that initial failure. What followed were 17 years of humiliation that would have broken a weaker person. Peter openly mocked Catherine before the court, flaunted his mistresses, and made it clear that he considered her an obstacle to his true ambitions. He was obsessed with Prussia and its military culture, often playing with toy soldiers for hours while neglecting his duties as heir to the throne. Meanwhile, Catherine endured each slight in public silence while privately building the network of relationships that would eventually destroy him. The key to understanding Catherine's later actions lies in recognizing how these years of degradation shaped her character. Every insult taught her about power's true nature. Every humiliation showed her how quickly respect could evaporate and how essential fear was to maintaining authority. She learned to smile while calculating revenge, to appear submissive while planning domination. The court that meant to break her spirit instead forged it into something unbreakable. Catherine's education during this period went far beyond the traditional accomplishments of royal wives. She read voraciously, consuming works by Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Diderot that would later influence her reforms. She studied Russian history, learning about the rebellions and coups that had shaped the empire's political culture. Most crucially, she observed how power actually functioned in Russia, noting the complex relationships between the throne, the nobility, the Orthodox Church, and the military. By the time Peter ascended to the throne in 1762, Catherine had spent nearly 2 decades preparing for this moment. She had allies in the military, connections throughout the nobility, and a reputation for intelligence that contrasted sharply with her husband's obvious inadequacies. When Peter began implementing policies that alienated every major power center in Russia, Catherine was ready to act. Peter's reign lasted exactly 6 months, but in that brief period, he managed to antagonize the Orthodox Church by favoring Lutheran practices, infuriate the military by praising Prussia, and horrify the nobility with erratic reforms. His final mistake was announcing his intention to divorce Catherine and marry his mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova. This wasn't just a personal insult, it was a political miscalculation that gave Catherine the justification she needed for what came next. The coup that brought Catherine to power was swift, decisive, and remarkably bloodless. On July 9, 1762, while Peter was at his palace outside St. Petersburg, Catherine appeared before the Izmailovsky regiment in the capital. The soldiers, already alienated by Peter's pro-Prussian policies, acclaimed her as their rightful empress. Within hours, other military units joined the rebellion, and by evening, Catherine controlled the capital completely. Peter's response to news of the coup revealed everything about his character that had made it inevitable. Instead of fighting or negotiating, he simply collapsed, offering to abdicate without condition and begging only to be allowed to return to his beloved Holstein with his mistress. The man who had inherited the largest empire in Europe surrendered it without firing a shot, confirming everyone's worst suspicions about his fitness to rule. What happened next remains one of history's most controversial episodes. Peter was placed under guard at a remote estate, officially for his own protection. Within a week, he was dead, allegedly from a violent argument with his guards that escalated into a fatal confrontation. Catherine claimed ignorance of the circumstances, but few believed her then, and fewer believe her now. Whether she ordered Peter's murder, merely allowed it to happen, or was genuinely surprised by the news, the result was the same: The last obstacle to her absolute power had been removed. The transformation of Sophie into Catherine was now complete. But the real work was just beginning. She faced the enormous challenge of legitimizing her rule in the eyes of both her subjects and foreign powers. She was a German usurper who had overthrown her husband and possibly arranged his murder. By every traditional measure, she had no right to the Russian throne. But Catherine understood something her critics did not. Legitimacy in Russia came not from bloodlines, but from results. The empire respected strength, expansion, and success. If she could deliver these things, her origins would become irrelevant. If she failed, her foreign birth would be used to explain every disaster. The stakes could not have been higher, and Catherine played the game with a skill that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. Her early years as empress revealed the strategic brilliance that would define her reign. She moved carefully to secure the loyalty of key institutions while projecting an image of confident authority. She increased military pay, honored the Orthodox Church, and reassured the nobility that their privileges would be protected. At the same time, she began the correspondence with Enlightenment philosophers that would establish her reputation as an intellectual monarch, a ruler guided by reason rather than mere tradition. The woman who had once been mocked as a provincial German princess was transforming herself into something Europe had never seen before. A female autocrat who ruled not through beauty or manipulation, but through raw political intelligence and an understanding of power that surpassed most of her male contemporaries. She was becoming Catherine the Great, though she didn't know it yet. But even as she consolidated her position and began the reforms that would reshape Russia, her enemies were watching, waiting, and planning. They understood that traditional methods of opposition would be useless against someone so politically astute. Catherine had neutralized military threats, bought off potential rivals, and established diplomatic relationships that protected her from foreign intervention. If they wanted to destroy her, they would need to find another way. They would need to attack something she couldn't defend with armies or gold, her reputation as a woman, and they would need to craft a lie so shocking, so memorable, so perfectly designed to overshadow her achievements that it would outlive her by centuries. The horse myth was still decades in the future, but its origins lay in these early years of Catherine's reign, when her success began to terrify people who believed women should never wield such power. Power. The enemies, gathering around Catherine's throne, understood a fundamental truth about destroying powerful women. You don't challenge their armies, you poison their stories. While Catherine consolidated her grip on Russia through military reforms and diplomatic brilliance, a different kind of warfare was brewing in the drawing rooms and coffee houses of Europe. Her critics faced an impossible problem. How do you attack someone who keeps winning? Catherine's first decade as empress was a masterclass in political survival. She inherited an empire that was vast but fragmented, powerful but unstable. Most rulers would have spent years simply maintaining what they had inherited. Catherine had different plans entirely. She looked at the map of Europe and saw not borders, but possibilities. Not limitations, but opportunities for expansion that would make Russia impossible to ignore. The military campaigns that followed weren't just conquests, they were statements. When Catherine declared war on the Ottoman Empire in 1768, European observers expected a typical border skirmish that would drain both sides and settle nothing. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented. Russian armies swept through Ottoman territories with a coordination and efficiency that shocked even Catherine's allies. The victory at Chesme Bay in 1770 saw the Russian fleet destroy an Ottoman force twice its size, announcing to the world that Russia was no longer a regional power, but a global threat. But military success was only part of Catherine's strategy. She understood that lasting power required cultural transformation as well as territorial expansion. While her armies carved new borders, Catherine was reshaping Russian society from within. She established the Hermitage as a showcase for European art and culture, transforming St. Petersburg into a city that could rival Paris or Vienna in sophistication. Foreign visitors who arrived expecting to find a backward northern kingdom instead discovered a court that sparkled with intellectual energy and artistic achievement. The scale of Catherine's cultural revolution was staggering. She purchased entire art collections from bankrupt European nobles, filling the palace with masterpieces that would have taken other monarchs generations to acquire. She corresponded regularly with Voltaire and Diderot, engaging in philosophical debates that were published across Europe. These weren't publicity stunts, but genuine intellectual exchanges that established Catherine as a serious thinker in her own right. Yet beneath this glittering surface, darker currents were flowing. Catherine's enlightened ideals crashed against the brutal realities of governing an empire built on serfdom and fear. The same woman who debated human rights with French philosophers also expanded the nobility's control over their peasants, binding millions of people more tightly to lives of inherited misery. This contradiction wasn't hypocrisy, but necessity. Catherine understood that her power depended on the support of the noble class, and she was prepared to sacrifice philosophical consistency for political survival. The tension between Catherine's public image and private actions reached a breaking point in 1773 when Yemelyan Pugachev launched the rebellion that would test her resolve like nothing before. Pugachev wasn't just another disgruntled nobleman or ambitious general. He was something far more dangerous. A charismatic leader who claimed to be Peter III, Catherine's supposedly murdered husband, returned from the dead to liberate the oppressed masses. The rebellion that followed was unlike anything Russia had seen since the time of troubles. Entire provinces fell to Pugachev's growing army of Cossacks, peasants, and ethnic minorities who saw in him a chance to overturn the social order that had crushed them for generations. Cities were sacked, landlords murdered, and imperial authority collapsed across vast stretches of territory. For months, it seemed possible that Catherine's empire might simply disintegrate under the weight of popular revolt. Catherine's response revealed the iron core beneath her enlightened exterior. She abandoned her correspondence with French philosophers and focused entirely on crushing the rebellion with methodical brutality. Her armies pursued Pugachev across the steppes like hunting hounds, leaving a trail of executed rebels and burned villages in their wake. When Pugachev was finally captured, Catherine ensured his execution was public, prolonged, and designed to serve as a warning to anyone who might consider following his example. The Pugachev rebellion changed Catherine permanently. Whatever romantic notions she might have harbored about improving the lives of Russia's peasants evaporated in the face of civil war. She emerged from the crisis more autocratic, more suspicious, and more willing to use terror as a tool of governance. The enlightened empress who had once dreamed of legal reforms and social progress now focused primarily on maintaining order through fear and force. But it was Catherine's personal life that provided her enemies with their most effective ammunition. The empress made no attempt to hide her romantic relationships, treating them as a natural part of royal prerogative. European kings had maintained mistresses for centuries without serious criticism, but Catherine was held to a different standard entirely. Each new favourite became fodder for scandalous speculation that grew more elaborate and vicious with every retelling. Gregory Orloff, the military officer who had helped engineer her coup, became her first major lover and remained influential in court for over a decade. Their relationship was passionate and political, combining genuine affection with strategic alliance. When it ended, Catherine ensured Orlov received titles, estates, and honours that secured his loyalty and demonstrated her gratitude. This pattern would repeat with subsequent favourites, creating a network of former lovers who remained bound to her through both emotion and self-interest. The relationship that most scandalized Europe was Catherine's connection with Grigory Potemkin, a man whose intelligence matched her own, and whose ambitions complemented her imperial vision. Potemkin wasn't just a lover, but a partner in power, commanding armies and governing territories with authority that made him almost a co-ruler. Their correspondence reveals a relationship of extraordinary intimacy and mutual respect, conducted in a mixture of Russian, French, and private codes that kept their secrets safe from court spies. Whether Catherine and Potemkin were secretly married remains one of history's great mysteries, but their partnership redefined what was possible between a female ruler and her male advisors. Potemkin conquered Crimea, built cities, and shaped imperial policy with a freedom that no other subordinate enjoyed. Their relationship demonstrated Catherine's ability to maintain personal connections without compromising political authority. But it also provided her critics with endless material for salacious speculation. The younger men who followed Potemkin were treated differently by both Catherine and her critics. These relationships were more ornamental than political, offering the aging empress companionship and flattery rather than genuine partnership. Catherine's generosity toward these favorites, showering them with gifts and titles, was interpreted by hostile observers as evidence of an insatiable appetite that grew more grotesque with age. The narrative being constructed around her personal life was shifting from political criticism to moral condemnation. European courts watched Catherine's romantic arrangements with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Her openness about relationships that other rulers conducted in secret was seen as evidence of either remarkable honesty or shocking depravity, depending on the observer's political sympathies. What remained constant was the double standard that judged Catherine's behavior by criteria that were never applied to her male counterparts. This gendered criticism intensified as Catherine's power grew. Each military victory, each territorial acquisition, each diplomatic triumph made her more threatening to the established order that assumed female rulers would be weak, manipulable, or temporary. Catherine was none of these things. She was becoming something Europe had never seen before, a woman who wielded absolute power without apology or limitation. By the 1780s, Catherine had transformed Russia from a regional kingdom into a European empire. She had crushed internal rebellions, defeated foreign enemies, and established cultural institutions that rivaled anything in Paris or London. Her correspondence with Enlightenment thinkers had made her famous across the continent as a philosopher queen, while her military campaigns had made her feared as a conqueror. She was, by any objective measure, one of the most successful rulers of her age. But success made her dangerous in ways that went beyond mere politics. Catherine represented a challenge to fundamental assumptions about gender, power, and authority that threatened to undermine the entire European social order. If a woman could rule as effectively as any king, what did that say about the natural superiority men claimed? If female leadership could produce such remarkable results, why were women excluded from power elsewhere? These questions terrified Catherine's enemies more than her armies ever could. Military defeats could be avenged, territorial losses reclaimed, diplomatic setbacks reversed. But if Catherine succeeded in demonstrating that women could rule as effectively as men, she would unleash forces that could reshape society itself. The stakes were no longer just about Russian expansion or European balance of power. They were about the fundamental structure of civilization itself. The response, when it came, would be more vicious than anything Catherine had faced on the battlefield. Her enemies understood that conventional weapons were useless against someone so politically skilled. If they wanted to destroy Catherine the Great, they would need to attack something armies couldn't defend: her identity as a woman. They would need to craft a lie so shocking that it would overshadow every achievement and reduce the most powerful ruler in Europe to a figure of ridicule and disgust. The horse myth was still years away, but its psychological foundations were being laid in these decades of Catherine's triumph. Each victory made the eventual lie more necessary. Each success made the coming slander more inevitable. Catherine's enemies were learning that the only way to defeat an invincible empress was to transform her into something too shameful to remember. Her into something too sham, evil to remember. The seeds of Catherine's destruction were planted not in the battlefields where she conquered empires, but in the whispered conversations of European salons where reputation was currency and scandal was sport. By the 1780s, Catherine had achieved something that made her enemies desperate. She had proven that a woman could rule better than most men. This revelation threatened to crack the foundation of every patriarchal system across the continent, and desperate times called for desperate measures. The architects of Catherine's character assassination understood the psychology of scandal with surgical precision. They knew that humans possessed an almost unlimited capacity to believe the worst about those who made them feel inadequate. Catherine's successes had made her a living reproach to every man who claimed natural superiority, every king who ruled through birthright rather than ability, every philosopher who argued that women lacked the intellectual capacity for leadership. The solution wasn't to match her achievements, but to destroy the memory of them entirely. The campaign began subtly, as these things always do. Court gossips in Vienna whispered about Catherine's unusual height and masculine bearing. Parisian salonières speculated about her deep voice and commanding presence. London coffeehouses buzzed with tales of her unnatural appetite for power and pleasure alike. Each story was carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt about Catherine's essential femininity, preparing the ground for something far more devastating to come. The genius of this early propaganda lay in its apparent restraint. Catherine's critics didn't accuse her of anything explicitly monstrous. They simply suggested that something was fundamentally wrong with a woman who wielded such authority. They weaponized the very qualities that made her an effective ruler against her, transforming strength into aggression, intelligence into cunning, and independence into depravity. The message was clear. Normal women didn't behave this way. Religious authorities provided intellectual cover for these attacks by citing biblical passages about women's proper role in society. Catholic priests thundered from pulpits about the dangers of female rule, while Protestant ministers warned that Catherine's success represented a violation of divine order. The Orthodox Church, despite benefiting enormously from Catherine's patronage, maintained a careful silence that spoke volumes about the discomfort even her allies felt with her unprecedented power. The French Revolution of 1789 provided Catherine's enemies with their most potent weapon yet. As Paris descended into chaos and royal heads began rolling, conservative forces across Europe looked for someone to blame for unleashing these democratic demons. Catherine, with her correspondence with Voltaire and her reputation for Enlightenment thinking, became a perfect scapegoat. Never mind that she had grown increasingly conservative in her later years, or that she viewed the French revolutionaries with horror. The narrative was too useful to abandon for mere facts. British propagandists proved particularly skilled at connecting Catherine to the revolutionary contagion sweeping across Europe. They portrayed her reign as evidence of what happened when natural order was overthrown, when women usurped male authority and chaos inevitably followed. The fact that Russia remained stable while France collapsed was ignored in favor of a more convenient story about the dangers of female ambition. German intellectuals, still smarting from Catherine's transformation from minor princess to great power ruler, contributed their own poison to the growing mythology. They emphasized her foreign origins, portraying her as an interloper who had corrupted pure Russian traditions with alien ideas. The irony that many of these critics were themselves German was lost in the fervor to diminish someone who had outgrown her origins so completely. The personal attacks grew more vicious as Catherine aged. Critics who had once focused on her policies now obsessed over her appearance, describing her in terms that would have been considered slanderous if applied to any male ruler. They mocked her weight gain, her wrinkles, her grey hair, as if physical aging somehow invalidated her political achievements. The double standard was breathtaking in its audacity and revealing in its desperation. Catherine's relationship with younger men provided her enemies with particularly rich material for character assassination. Each new favorite was portrayed not as a political appointment or personal companion, but as evidence of an aging woman's grotesque inability to accept her declining attractions. The fact that European kings routinely took mistresses decades their junior was conveniently forgotten when the genders were reversed. The propaganda campaign reached new heights of creativity when describing Catherine's supposed sexual appetites. Enemies who couldn't challenge her military victories or administrative reforms instead crafted elaborate fantasies about her private life. These stories grew more extreme with each retelling, building towards something that would eventually transcend mere gossip to become historical mythology. What made these attacks particularly effective was their ability to reduce Catherine's complex legacy to simple, memorable images. The woman who had expanded Russia's borders, built magnificent cultural institutions, and corresponded with the greatest minds of her age, was gradually being transformed into a caricature of female excess and depravity. Her enemies understood that people would remember a shocking story long after they forgot a list of achievements. The psychological warfare being waged against Catherine operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Surface attacks focused on her policies and decisions, providing cover for deeper assaults on her fundamental right to wield power as a woman. The most devastating criticism wasn't that Catherine had made bad choices, but that she had made any choices at all without seeking male approval or guidance. European diplomats contributed to this campaign through carefully worded dispatches that emphasized Catherine's unnaturalness while maintaining plausible deniability. They described her as ruling like a man, speaking with a man's authority, and conducting herself with a man's disregard for feminine propriety. These observations were presented as objective reporting, while functioning as character assassination disguised as journalism. The emerging narrative portrayed Catherine not as a successful ruler, but as a woman who had betrayed her essential nature in pursuit of masculine power. This framing allowed her critics to acknowledge her achievements while simultaneously arguing that they were illegitimate because they violated natural law. The message was clear: Catherine's successes were aberrations that proved nothing about women's capabilities in general. Literary figures across Europe began incorporating thinly veiled references to Catherine into their works, creating fictional characters who combined her achievements with increasingly grotesque personal characteristics. These portrayals served as vehicles for expressing anxieties about female power, while maintaining enough distance to avoid direct confrontation with someone who commanded armies and diplomatic influence. The cumulative effect of this sustained assault was to create an atmosphere where any rumor about Catherine, no matter how outrageous, would find a receptive audience. Her enemies had spent decades preparing the ground, planting seeds of doubt about her character that would bloom into something monstrous when the right moment arrived. They had transformed one of history's most successful rulers into a figure primed for legendary scandal. By the 1790s, as Catherine entered her final years, the machinery of character destruction was fully operational and waiting for an opportunity to deploy its ultimate weapon. Her enemies had learned that conventional political opposition was useless against someone so skilled at the game of power. If they wanted to destroy Catherine the Great, they would need to attack something no army could defend and no achievement could shield: her identity as a woman who had dared to rule without apology. The stage was set for the most devastating character assassination in royal history, a lie so perfectly crafted that it would outlive empires and reshape how the world remembered one of its most remarkable rulers. All that remained was for Catherine to provide the final ingredient: her death, and the moment when she could no longer defend herself against the monsters her enemies were preparing to unleash upon her memory. The moment finally arrived on November 16th, 1796, when Catherine collapsed in her private chambers at the Winter Palace. The 77-year-old empress had been reviewing state papers when she suddenly felt faint, retreating to a small adjoining room where she fell unconscious on the marble floor. Her servants found her there hours later, breathing shallowly, her face pale as winter frost. The court physicians were summoned immediately, but their desperate treatments proved futile against what was clearly a massive stroke. For nearly 24 hours, Catherine drifted between consciousness and oblivion while the palace held its breath. Courtiers whispered in corners, making frantic calculations about succession and survival. Her son, Paul, who had waited decades for this moment, paced the corridors with barely concealed anticipation. Foreign ambassadors sent urgent dispatches to their capitals, reporting that the great empress was finally dying. By the morning of November 17th, Catherine the Great was gone. Her extraordinary life concluded as suddenly as it had begun, 44 years earlier, when she seized the throne from her inadequate husband. The official cause of death was recorded as apoplexy, what we would now call a stroke. Multiple witnesses, including physicians and court officials, documented the circumstances surrounding her collapse and death. There was nothing mysterious about it, nothing scandalous, nothing unusual beyond the natural end of an aging ruler who had carried the enormous burdens of empire for over 4 decades. Catherine died in her bed, surrounded by the trappings of power she had wielded so effectively, her body finally succumbing to the relentless pressures of absolute rule. But within hours of her death, something sinister began stirring in the shadows of European politics. The enemies who had spent decades waiting for this moment finally had their opportunity. Catherine could no longer defend herself, could no longer command armies, or deploy diplomatic pressure against her critics. She was vulnerable for the first time in her adult life, and her adversaries moved with the speed of predators who had scented blood on the wind. The attack began in France, where revolutionary fervour had transformed hatred of monarchy into a savage art form. French propagandists, still drunk on the blood of their own king and queen, saw Catherine's death as an opportunity to strike one final blow against the old order she had represented. They had been frustrated for years by their inability to damage someone so politically astute, so militarily successful, so diplomatically protected. Death had finally leveled the playing field. The initial rumors were relatively tame by the standards of what would come later. French newspapers suggested that Catherine had died while engaging in unnatural acts, that her legendary appetite for pleasure had finally consumed her. These early stories lacked specific details but established the crucial foundation for what would follow. The idea that Catherine's death was somehow connected to her sexuality, that her legendary appetites had played a role in her demise. German intellectuals, particularly those from regions that had felt the weight of Russian expansion, eagerly amplified these whispers. They added their own embellishments, suggesting that Catherine's foreign origins had made her susceptible to perversions unknown in civilized society. The narrative being constructed portrayed her not as a great ruler who had died naturally, but as a depraved woman whose exotic appetites had led to a shameful end. British propagandists proved particularly inventive in their contributions to the growing mythology. They understood the power of specific, memorable details in making abstract accusations feel real. Someone, somewhere in London's coffeehouses or gentlemen's clubs, first suggested the involvement of a horse. The image was so shocking, so viscerally disturbing, that it immediately captured imaginations across Europe. The horse element transformed vague accusations of depravity into something concrete and unforgettable. Suddenly, the whispers had a central image around which to crystallize. The story evolved rapidly, acquiring mechanical details about pulleys and harnesses that gave it a veneer of plausibility while making it even more grotesque. Each retelling added new elements, new complications, new horrors that made the tale more memorable and more damaging. The genius of the horse myth lay in its psychological sophistication. It didn't just attack Catherine's reputation, It attacked the very concept of female power itself. The story suggested that women who exceeded their natural boundaries would inevitably be destroyed by their own uncontrolled appetites. It was a warning disguised as gossip, a threat wrapped in the language of scandal. The myth spread with remarkable speed across European society, carried by diplomats, merchants, travelers, and anyone else who enjoyed sharing shocking news. It leaped from court to court, salon to salon, tavern to tavern, growing more elaborate and disturbing with each transmission. The lack of any credible evidence only seemed to enhance its appeal, as people filled the gaps with their own imaginations and prejudices. What made the story particularly effective was its ability to reduce Catherine's entire legacy to a single, shameful image. Her territorial conquests, cultural achievements, administrative reforms, and diplomatic triumphs were suddenly overshadowed by a tale of bestial depravity. The woman who had corresponded with Voltaire and built the Hermitage was transformed into a figure of grotesque comedy, her serious accomplishments buried beneath layers of manufactured scandal. The horse scandal that haunts Catherine the Great's memory stands as perhaps history's most successful character assassination. A masterpiece of propaganda that transformed one of Europe's most accomplished rulers into a punchline that echoes through centuries. Her enemies understood what her armies never could defeat, that reputation, once poisoned, becomes nearly impossible to purify. Today, when we strip away the lies and examine the evidence, we find not the depraved monster of legend, but a brilliant strategist who expanded an empire, fostered culture, and wielded power with a skill that terrified those who believed women should never rule at all.